Hi quilters, this is the 7th video in our series of videos designed to use 2.5-inch strips. This month's project features a 16-inch block that you can use to make any size quilt you want. All the pieces for the block are cut from 2.5-inch strips. I first used this block in our block of the month for 2022 for the December block. I'm going to give you 3 options for how to cut out the block. The first option is just using 4 different fabrics. You'll need 2 strips of a light, 1 strip each of a medium dark, and a dark. From the light fabric, cut 8 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 6.5 inches. From the medium fabric, cut 8 rectangles that are 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. From the medium dark and the dark, you need 1 strip that is 2.5 inches by 22 inches and 4 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. When cutting pieces for these blocks, I double check that I've cut all the pieces that I need, and then I put them together in a Ziploc bag so they stay together. Each block I cut gets its own bag. Another option is to do a controlled scrappy look. In order to get 8 of the 2.5 by 6.5 inch rectangles out of a light, you need 2 strips. If you don't have 2 strips, you can use 2 different lights and cut 4 each, 2.5 by 6.5 from the 2 different colored lights. I don't have enough of either of these brown fabrics to get 8 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangles, but combined I'll be able to get 4 of each. That will give me the total of 8 that I need for the block. For the medium dark, I'm going to have a strip of 1 fabric and then cut 4 squares of a different red for the other part of the block. And I will do the same with the dark fabric. My goal for this quilt is to have 30 blocks. It'll be set 5 blocks across, 6 blocks down, and will measure about 80 by 96 inches. I had a little bit of a head start as I had made 6 of these blocks in December of last year when I was testing the block the month pattern. So I only need to cut 24 blocks in order to get the 30 I need for the quilt top. If you want to, you can get all of the cutting done in one day, or you can space it out over a few days like I did. Another option for cutting out these blocks is to have every fabric in the block be a different fabric, so there's no matches at all in the entire block. So every fabric is different. This works really well if all you have are smaller pieces of fabric in your stash. You don't have to cut each piece separately. You can line your pieces up and then cut multiple pieces at one time. But if you notice, I am cutting 8 different fabrics for the light. I will cut 8 different fabrics for the medium. I will have 2 different strips for my medium dark and dark. And then the 4 squares will all be picked out of a bucket that I have of extra squares left over from other projects. There is no wrong way to cut out the pieces for this block. You can even mix and match the cutting methods. So for example, you could have all your lights be different fabrics, but use 1 fabric for the medium and 1 fabric for the medium dark and 1 fabric for the dark, or kind of a combination of each. There's no wrong way to cut. The important part is that you're using up leftover fabrics from other projects. In the next step, I'm going to take you through the process of making one block. Now, usually when I'm sewing, I'm making multiple blocks at a time, but for the demonstration of this video, I am going to just take you through the piecing of one block. Now that our blocks are cut, it's time to sew. We're going to piece using 1/4-inch seam allowances. Take all the pieces out of the bag, and then we're going to put right sides together, the two longer strips. Set aside 4 of the light rectangles that are 2.5 by 6.5, and then on each end of the other 4 rectangles, we're going to put 2 of the dark pieces and then 2 of the medium pieces. And then we're going to set aside 4 of the medium rectangles, and then we're going to put 2 dark and 2 medium dark on the ends of those rectangles. I'm going to put the spare rectangles back into the bag to keep them safe, and then it's time to sew. I'm going to sew the strip set together, and then I'm going to put the squares on the ends of the rectangles. For the piecing of these blocks, I'm going to be using an ecru or beige colored thread that is close to the background colors of the blocks. You could also use a gray or any kind of blender thread. I try to sew as many things as I can before I have to head to the ironing board. That way I'm not constantly going back and forth between the sewing machine and the ironing board. If you're enjoying our series to use leftover 2.5-inch strips, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe. We will leave a link in the description below for the playlist of all of our 2.5-inch strip videos. Make sure to check it out. For the strip set, you want to press towards the darker fabric. For all of the rest of the pieces, you are going to press towards the rectangles. Now it's time to cut the strip set into 2.5-inch sections. There are 2 different ways you can do this. You can either cut each individual section by itself, so cut it at 5 inches and then 2.5, and then just keep going across until you have 8 pieces that you will need to make 4 4-patch units. Always double check when you're cutting that you're cutting in the right spot, because while this is a little longer than you need, it's not long enough to get a whole extra piece. You can always sew it back together and then recut it, but it's best to get it done the first time right. And of course, I always trim that extra little bit that's left over so that it's even on both sides. I don't know what I'll use it yet for, but I'll think of something. The other way that you can cut the strip set into the pieces needed for the 4-patch is to first cut a 10.5-inch section off one end, and then you're going to put them right sides together The seams will match in the center. That will automatically cut your pieces so that when you have them cut, they'll be ready to sew into your 4 patches. Now you just need to make 4 cuts, 2.5 inches each time, so a 5-inch, 2.5, and then another time 5-inch and 2.5. And they're already put together. The seams will butt together so that they'll nest, so that when you make your 4 patches, it's all ready to go. So first we're going to make the 4 patch units. If you've already got them put together, you can just start sewing. Otherwise, put right sides together, line up those center seams so they nest, and then sew with your 1/4-inch seam allowance. You can press the seams open or you can press the seams to one side. Next, we're going to piece the medium 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles to the 4 patch units. 2 of them will be sewn so that it touches the dark, and 2 of them will be sewn so it touches the medium. Pay careful attention to the position of the 4 patch units when you're doing this step. You're making 2 of each. For this step, we're pressing towards the rectangle. Next, we're going to add the pieces with the medium rectangles to the right sides of these units. The square in the upper right should match the square on the end of the rectangle you're adding on. The diagonal line from bottom left to upper right should all be the same fabric. The seams should nest together to help make sewing a little easier, and I usually double check to make sure I'm sewing the correct pieces together. If you'd like a printable pattern for the block, join our Facebook group called The Quilted Forest Friends, and you'll find the pattern titled December Block of the Month 2022 in the Files section. You'll be able to print that at home. We will leave a link to the video for that block in the description below if you want to check it out. Again, we are going to press towards the rectangle that was just added. Next, we'll be adding the 2.5-inch by 6.5-inch light rectangles to the piece that we just added on. we're going to press towards the rectangle. Now we're going to add the pieces that have the 2.5 inch by 6.5 inch rectangles, and we want to make sure that our diagonal line is all the same fabric. Now we have two each of the two quadrants, one that has a diagonal line with the dark and one that has a diagonal line with the medium dark. We're going to press both of these towards the rectangles that were just added on. Now we're going to make two half blocks with the quadrants placed as shown. If you trace the lines of the light fabric with your finger, they should make a question mark shape on its side, so both of the units the same. I add a pin to the side that I'm supposed to be sewing. That way, between here and the sewing machine, I don't forget which side I'm sewing. Some of these seams will need to be pinned to make sure that you get the corners to meet correctly. Some will nest and some won't. Press towards the section with the light rectangle. Turn this top one 180 degrees to sew it to the other half. The center seam should nest together, and the other two seams that will have a place to meet, they will either nest or they won't. I usually pinned all three of these seams just to make sure as I was sewing that they didn't move. One last seam to sew and the block is finished. I did the math, and each block uses 152 inches of a 2.5 inch strip if you combine all the pieces, which is about 3.8 strips. So I'm going to average 4 strips per block. 4 strips at 2.5 inches wide is 10 inches of fabric, regular width of fabric per block. So if you made 12 blocks, set it 3 across by 4 down, it would measure 48.5 by 64.5 and would use about 3 1/3 yards of fabric. Once you've pressed the seam to one side or open, you want to make sure that your medium dark and dark form a diagonal line, and that when you trace the light fabrics, they make a figure 8. Now that I've taken you through all the steps to make a single block, I'm going to give you a glimpse of how I really sew. If I have a short amount of time available to me, I might just make a single block or maybe 2 blocks just to kill a little time. Sometimes I will start one block And then when I get about halfway through that block, I'll start a second block as I'm still sewing the first one, and so on and so forth until I'm working on multiple blocks at a time. I just keep feeding things through the sewing machine until I need to stop to press things so that I can keep going and keep on adding to the list. I do try to stay organized. I don't want to open all the bags at once, but as I finish a block and that bag is empty, I can then open a new bag. And so I just keep rotating those new pieces in and starting another block. As I was sewing these blocks together, I started to think about how big this quilt was going to be if I set it for 5 by 6, which would be 30 blocks. It would be 80 by 96. So I thought that was getting to be a little bit big for what I really intended. So I decided to make it 4 by 5 instead, so that it would measure 64 by 80, more of a lap size quilt. And then I was going to end up having 10 blocks left over. And I thought to myself, if I make 2 more blocks, I'll have 12 blocks. I can set that 3 by 4, add a border all the way around, and I can use that for the backing of the 20 blocks. So I'd have a 2-sided quilt. So by making 2 more blocks, I would have 20 blocks on the front, 12 blocks plus a border on the backing, and I would use a grand total of 320 inches of fabric. That's divided by 36 inches in a yard equals about 9 yards of fabric that's going to go into the blocks, and then another maybe 2 yards for the border. And then I used my leftover strips, little pieces and bigger chunks, and made a scrappy binding. So I didn't even have to use a separate binding fabric. I just used my leftover strips. I love the fact that all of the fabric for this quilt top and the backing was fabric left over from other things except for the border piece. As I was sorting through the blocks when I was finished, I was trying to pick out a favorite block, and I just thought it was cool to see them all, how they turned out, and how the color changes the look of the block. I'm really glad I did a lot of different lights for the background, and it's amazing to see how sometimes you really see the X with the diagonal lines, and sometimes how it's a little bit hidden. It was a lot of fun to put these blocks together. I combined batik fabrics with regular cottons. I have a lot of stripes in there, which I think are fantastic in this design. And I used a lot of fabric that was really, really old, so I'm proud of myself for that. The nice thing about these blocks, once they were cut and put in those bags for myself to keep myself organized, I could work on just a few blocks if I only had a little time, or I could work on more if I had a whole day of sewing. So you can really finish it quickly if you want to. Once I had all the blocks done, then it was time to figure out how I wanted to put it together, if I wanted to have all the blocks pointing the same way, or if I wanted to alternate some, how I wanted to configure it so it would look its best. When I laid it out, I had them all pointing the same way to begin with, just to see how that would look. I took a picture with my phone so I could compare it to this version, in which I alternated every other block. It gives a totally different look. I wasn't as fond as this one. And then when I put together the backing, I had to arrange that one too, so I kind of had them go a different direction for the back. After I got the quilt put together in the rows and then sewed the rows together, I put the backing on it, put it on the quilting machine, got it quilted, and then I did the machine binding. For the quilting pattern, I just used stipple or meander, whatever you like to call it, and it's just curvy lines that go all over. They don't cross, it's just curves. And I thought it would look good from both sides of the quilt, so from the front and the back, it would look about the same. I love looking at the diagonal lines on this, how they make your eye travel all around the quilt to look at all the different fabrics, and also the secondary design of the little windmill shape made by the light fabrics. For the batting, I used warm and natural batting. It's my favorite. I've been using it for years, and it helps the quilts keep a nice shape, and it drapes really well, and it really gets soft. The more you use the quilt, the softer it seems to get. For the back side, I had to think about the borders so that it would kind of center that piece that has the blocks. And I used a lighter fabric instead of a dark because I really wanted the blocks to stand out. So now, how did I do on using up my fabric strips? Well, this is what my strip bucket looked like when I started cutting out the blocks. And this is all I had left at the end. But my overall strip bucket didn't change much because I kind of had to put those old strips back in. But there's always next month, so let's hope I can do better next month. Until then, we hope you'll hit the like button, leave us a comment, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!